They say in the backwoods of Kentucky, in 1875, there was a house no one dared speak of aloud. A house where those who crossed its threshold found their voices stolen, not by trickery, not by threat, but by a force older than law, older than memory. Imagine stepping across the threshold of a building where words, the very tool humans used to assert thought, vanish into thin air. Every sentence you try to form dies in your throat. Your mind races, your lips move, and yet silence is the only response. No one outside the house hears your screams. No one inside speaks. Only observation remains, and the unrelenting weight of your own awareness. The house was said to have been built by a man whose obsession with silence was absolute. He studied the mind's reliance on speech, how authority is enforced through conversation, and how fear can spread faster than rumor. He discovered, or perhaps inherited, a method, ritualized, geometric, psychological, capable of severing the link between thought and expression. Some say it was alchemy, others insist it was science lost to time, and a few whisper that the man had made a bargain with something that existed between worlds. Whatever it was, the results were undeniable. Every visitor became silent, every witness became paralyzed, and the house's reputation grew until it was both legend and warning. Consider the implications. Silence is power. The ability to strip someone of their voice is the ultimate form of control, because speech is the foundation of action, rebellion, and influence. Without words, you cannot plead, argue, or negotiate. Without voice, even thought feels trapped. Those who entered the house discovered not merely terror, but a quiet lesson in domination, the psychological dismantling of the individual. Authority here was absolute and invisible. You did not resist because resistance required articulation. You did not flee because movement without thought leaves you frozen. The house did not attack. It revealed the fragility of human control, the ease with which civilization's veneer can be peeled away. And this is your first awakening. Knowledge itself can be weaponized. Power does not need brutality. It needs subtlety, anticipation, and alignment with human instinct. The house, with its silence, its geometry, and its rituals, became a school of forbidden mastery. Those who entered came out changed, or never came out at all. Imagine the fear, the curiosity, the unspoken understanding that some truths exist not to inform, but to dominate. That is where we begin. The man who built the house was known publicly as Elias Crowder, a quiet landowner with no documented past before the Civil War's final years. But records from county archives hint at something far darker beneath the surface. Crowder was not merely a farmer or carpenter. He was a collector of ideas, of forbidden manuscripts, of methods that explored how the human mind collapses when stripped of expression. He believed speech was not natural, but programmed, learned, enforced, and if it could be interrupted, the human being beneath it could be reshaped. Crowder had spent years moving through hospitals, prisons, and asylums left abandoned after the war, places soaked in suffering, where the mind had been broken repeatedly by isolation and fear. He observed that the most effective punishment was never pain. It was silence. Solitary confinement did more damage than whips. With no voice to project identity outward, men dissolved inward. Crowder took notes obsessively. He filled journals with diagrams, ratios, spatial measurements. He studied how rooms affected thought, how angles disrupted breathing, how certain proportions caused discomfort without obvious cause. When he acquired the land in Kentucky, he designed the house as an instrument rather than a shelter. Every hallway followed a deliberate ratio. Every doorway was aligned slightly off true north. The walls were layered with dense limestone and iron, materials believed, both scientifically and mystically, to interfere with resonance. Sound behaved strangely inside. Even footsteps seemed to vanish too quickly, swallowed by the structure. Visitors described the sensation not as muteness, but as disconnection, as if the part of the mind responsible for translation had been severed. Thoughts existed, but could not cross into reality. What makes this dangerous is not superstition, but intent. Crowder understood something institutions would later perfect. Control does not require chains. It requires architecture, environment, and psychological anticipation. The house conditioned silence before its victims even opened their mouths. They felt it approaching, an invisible pressure tightening around cognition itself. Panic did not help. Struggle accelerated collapse. The more they tried to speak, the more resistance they felt, until submission became instinctive. Here is the truth buried beneath the legend. This was not madness. It was experimentation. Long before modern interrogation science, long before behavioral conditioning became policy, Crowder was refining a system that turned awareness into a prison. The house was not haunted. It was calibrated. And once built, it could not simply be undone, because its power did not rely on Crowder anymore. It relied on the human mind walking into it, expecting nothing, and losing everything. What happened next is where the town's silence begins to make sense. The first confirmed visitor was a traveling surveyor sent by the state to evaluate land boundaries. He entered the house in mid-afternoon and never raised his voice again for the rest of his life. Witnesses said he emerged 3 hours later with his eyes wide open, mouth moving as if reciting a prayer, yet no sound escaped. He wrote frantically for days afterward, filling pages with fragmented sentences that ended abruptly, as though the words themselves refused to complete the thought. Within a week, even writing failed him. His hand shook. His mind raced. His silence became total. Others followed. A preacher convinced himself the house was demonic and believed faith would shield him. He crossed the threshold carrying scripture, confident in his authority. 10 minutes inside, his confidence collapsed. He later described, only once, in a whisper, an overwhelming sense of being observed by the space itself. The house did not react to him. It anticipated him. Every belief he carried felt predictable, already accounted for. By the time he realized prayer required voice, and voice was gone, submission had already replaced resistance. This is the pattern the town refused to articulate. The house did not steal voices randomly. It targeted certainty. Those most convinced of their control lost it fastest. Crowder had engineered the structure to exploit a specific weakness in the human psyche, the reliance on language to regulate fear. When words disappear, panic cannot be organized. When panic cannot be organized, control collapses. The visitors weren't punished. They were rendered psychologically incomplete. The townspeople noticed something else, something far more unsettling. The house did not affect locals in the same way. Those born nearby could enter the outer rooms and retain partial speech. Outsiders lost everything. This suggested conditioning. Prolonged exposure built tolerance. Silence, once familiar, became survivable. This is where the unspoken agreement took shape. The house was dangerous, yes, but it was also useful. It punished strangers. It discouraged inquiry. It protected isolation. And here lies the forbidden truth. When a system benefits a population, morality becomes negotiable. The town did not warn visitors because warning would require explanation. Explanation would create attention. Attention would invite authority. So silence spread, not enforced, but adopted. The house trained the town just as it trained its victims. Say nothing. Ask nothing. Allow the structure to wake. This was no haunting. It was an early model of institutional compliance, perfected not by law, but by fear embedded into architecture. By the third year, the house had stopped being a curiosity and had become a boundary. Maps did not mark it, but behavior did. Travelers were redirected without explanation. Children were taught early which road curved too sharply, which patch of land felt wrong underfoot. No one called it a rule. It was instinct, inherited and reinforced without words. The town had learned the first law of forbidden systems. Survival favors those who adapt quietly. Crowder no longer needed to invite anyone inside. Curiosity did the work for him. Authority figures, judges, academics, clerics, were drawn to the rumors precisely because they believed themselves immune. And every time one of them entered and emerged broken, the lesson deepened. Power does not announce itself. Power waits. Those who believe they are in control are the easiest to dismantle, because their identity depends on certainty. The house stripped that certainty away with surgical precision. Something else was happening beneath the surface. Visitors who lost their voices did not simply become silent, they became observant. Hyperaware. They noticed details others ignored. Angles of roofs, pacing of footsteps, the timing of light through windows. Several survivors described an overwhelming realization that most of human life runs on scripts. Words follow patterns. Reactions repeat. Once speech was gone, they saw the machinery behind conversation itself. It was terrifying. And it was clarifying. Crowder documented everything. He tracked how long it took for silence to set in, which personalities resisted longer, which backgrounds collapsed faster. Men trained in command, officers, pastors, politicians, failed almost immediately. Laborious, craftsmen, men accustomed to long hours without speech lasted longer. This revealed something dangerous. Society conditions dependence on voice as a symbol of rank. Remove the symbol, and hierarchy disintegrates. The house was not anti-human. It was anti-illusion. This is where institutions quietly took notice. Letters arrived with no return address. Visitors came at night, alone, carrying authority without uniforms. They did not stay long. They asked few questions. But after they left, Crowder made changes, minor adjustments to walls, new layers added, Satan angles reinforced. The house evolved. Understand this clearly. Once a system proves it can reliably neutralize identity without visible violence, it becomes valuable. Silence is not absence, it is containment. The house demonstrated that control could be achieved without chains, cells, or guards, only environment and anticipation. And the town understood the cost of survival. To speak of the house was to draw attention. Attention leads to intervention. Intervention leads to loss of control. So they chose silence, not because they were victims, but because they were complicit. The most effective systems do not force obedience. They make cooperation feel like the only intelligent option. By the time federal interest became undeniable, the House had already done its most important work. It had proven that suppression does not need to be loud to be absolute. Officials who reviewed reports struggled with language itself. How do you document a place where the primary evidence is absence? No blood, no marks, no corpses, only men who returned unable to speak. Their authority evaporated, their certainty dismantled. To a system built on record and testimony, silence was a problem that could not be processed. This is where the story becomes darker. Several visitors never officially entered the house. Their names appear in travel logs, letters, and rail manifests, but disappear from public records shortly afterward. No death certificates. No missing persons bulletins. The implication is simple and terrifying. Silence is administratively convenient. A man who cannot speak cannot accuse. A man who cannot articulate cannot testify. Remove voice, and you remove friction. Crowder was summoned once to Frankfurt. He returned thinner, quieter, but unchanged. Those who saw him noticed something unsettling. He did not answer questions directly anymore. He waited. He allowed others to talk themselves into conclusions. He had learned what the house taught best, that most people reveal more than they realize when desperate to fill silence. This is mastery most never reach. The house itself became more precise over time. Survivors reported the loss of voice happening faster, almost immediately. Crowder had refined the thresholds, small architectural changes that accelerated psychological collapse. This was no longer experimentation. It was optimization. And optimization suggests an end user. Here is the truth hidden beneath the folklore. The house functioned as a prototype, a controlled environment demonstrating how identity could be neutralized without confrontation. No riots, no martyrs, no resistance, because resistance requires articulation. This principle would later appear in interrogation rooms, isolation protocols, and bureaucratic processes designed to exhaust rather than confront. Kentucky was not an anomaly. It was an early signal. The town, meanwhile, prospered quietly. Trade routes avoided the area, but those who stayed found stability. No outside interference. No questions. No disruption. This is the bargain every institution eventually offers, safety in exchange for silence. And once accepted, it becomes self-policing. Parents trained children without explanation. Strangers were redirected kindly but firmly. The house did not need guards. The town had internalized the rule. Understand this. Silence is not always imposed from above. Often, it is chosen from below. And once chosen, it becomes the strongest wall there is. What no one outside the town understood was that the house did not simply remove voices. It reordered time inside the mind. Survivors described minutes stretching into hours, thoughts looping without progression, awareness folding inward with nowhere to go. When speech vanished, internal narration grew louder, then fractured. Without the ability to externalize thought, men were forced to confront themselves without filters, without performance, without identity armor. Many broke not from fear, but from recognition. Crowder called this the reversal. In his private notes, later recovered and immediately sealed, he wrote that speech is how humans escape themselves. Words project identity outward, turning inner chaos into organized sound. Remove that outlet, and the mind is nowhere to evacuate pressure. The house exploited this flaw. It didn't dominate through terror. It forced confrontation without release. This is why authority figures collapsed fastest. Their identities depended on expression. Without it, they were nothing but exposed cognition. One visitor, a former Union officer, was able to write a single coherent sentence afterward before descending into silence. The line was simple and devastating. It did not silence me. It showed me I was never speaking freely to begin with. That sentence never reached newspapers. It vanished into an evidence box, stamped and buried. Some truths cannot be allowed to circulate because they infect everything they touch. The house began to attract a different kind of visitor, men who were not curious, but intentional. They arrived knowing they might lose their voice. Some believed silence would strengthen them. Others believed it would cleanse them. A few believed endurance equaled mastery. Most were wrong. Those who entered willingly suffered longer, because anticipation amplified collapse. The house punished preparation. It rewarded ignorance. This reveals a deeper law of psychological systems. The more you believe you understand a system, the more vulnerable you are to it. Crowder understood this better than any academic of his era. He never lectured. He never explained. He allowed the house to teach directly. By now, the town no longer whispered. Silence was no longer fear-based. It was structural. Speech about the house felt inappropriate, like violating a natural order. This is how control systems mature. First they frighten, then they normalize. Finally, they feel inevitable. And here's where you must listen carefully. The most dangerous mechanisms in history were never announced as weapons. They presented themselves as environments, procedures, safeguards. You step into them willingly, believing yourself in control, until you discover control was never the point. The house in Kentucky was not unique because of what it did. It was unique because it proved how easily the human mind can be neutralized, without restraints, without violence, and without leaving a mark. This is the descent, from legend, to experiment, to method. And once a method exists, it never stays buried forever. Once a method is proven, it stops belonging to the man who discovered it. That was the moment the house ceased to be Crowder's. He still lived there, still maintained it, but the principle had escaped him. Silence as a mechanism had been validated, and history shows that validated mechanisms are never left unused. They are studied, abstracted, and replicated in subtler forms. The house was not copied brick by brick. It was translated. You must understand how this happens. Institutions do not adopt superstition. They adopt results. And the result here was undeniable. Identity collapse without visible force. No rebellion. No scandal. No blood. Just compliance, confusion, and permanent psychological alteration. In reports circulated quietly between departments, the house was not referred to as a location. It was referred to as a condition, an environment that produced predictable outcomes when variables were aligned correctly. Crowder noticed the shift. Visitors stopped asking questions. They measured. They timed responses. They observed breathing patterns. They paid attention to thresholds. How long before silence emerged? What behaviors accelerated it? What gestures preceded collapse? This was no longer curiosity. It was harvesting. The house had become a living diagram of how power works when it stops demanding and starts waiting. Around this time, changes in the town became visible, though no one commented on them. Schoolrooms grew quieter. Church sermons shortened. Men who once argued openly learned to pause, to think twice before speaking, to read faces rather than challenge them. Silence began spreading outward, not as fear, but as efficiency. Conversation became transactional. Emotion receded. Observation replaced expression. Here is the truth most people never confront. Speech is not encouraged because it frees you. It is encouraged because it identifies you. Once systems learn how to suppress voice selectively, without force, they gain the ability to shape behavior without resistance. You do not need to threaten a man who has learned silence feels safer than speech. The house did not teach obedience directly. It taught hesitation. And hesitation is enough. A man who hesitates will self-edit. A population that self-edits will never revolt. Crowder had created a place where hesitation was absolute, and the lesson lingered long after visitors left the property. Some say the house eventually stopped working. That is incorrect. The house achieved its final form when it no longer needed to function actively. Its lesson had dispersed. Silence had been normalized. The method had been absorbed into other environments, offices, cells, systems, protocols, places where no one calls it silence, but everyone feels it. And now you stand at an uncomfortable threshold. Because if a wooden house in rural Kentucky could erase identity by removing voice, what do modern structures, cleaner, quieter, bureaucratic, accomplish every day without you noticing? The house was never the danger. The danger was the proof it provided. By the late 1870s, Crowder's name began to fade from any document that mattered. He still existed, but only in function, not in relevance. This is how systems absorb their creators. Once a mechanism proves useful, the individual becomes expendable. Crowder had done his part. He demonstrated that control could be achieved without spectacle. After that, the system required only maintenance, not innovation. Something else changed inside the house itself. Survivors, fewer now, chosen more carefully, reported that the loss of voice was no longer sudden. Instead, it arrived as a narrowing. First, words felt heavy. Then sentences shortened. Then meaning itself began to compress, until only sensation remained. Fear gave way to passivity. Passivity gave way to acceptance. This was refinement. The collapse no longer shocked the mind. It guided it downward gently, making resistance feel unnecessary. This matters because shock creates memory, and memory creates testimony. Gradual suppression creates compliance. Crowder's early visitors were broken. His later visitors were reshaped. They exited functional, obedient, and unremarkable, unable to explain what had changed, only certain that speaking less felt correct. This is the evolution every control system seeks, invisibility through normalization. The town mirrored this progression. Outsiders noticed it first. Conversations stalled. Answers became vague. Questions went unanswered, not from hostility, but from disinterest. Silence was no longer threatening. It was efficient. Emotion drained from interaction. The town had become low friction, predictable, manageable. From an institutional perspective, this was perfection. Here is the suppressed realization buried in sealed correspondence from the period. The house removed not speech, but initiative. Once initiative vanished, speech followed naturally. This inverted everything people believed about power. Force was unnecessary, coercion inefficient. All that was required was an environment where expression felt pointless. And now the final transformation occurred, one few ever recognize. The house stopped being feared and began being respected. People did not go near it, not because it was dangerous, but because it had done its work. Like a boundary stone or grave marker, it symbolized a truth too heavy to revisit. This is when legends turn into structures, when warnings become customs, when control becomes tradition. This is why history rarely records the most effective systems of domination. They do not announce themselves. They dissolve into routine. You are taught not to notice them, to accept them as normal, to believe silence is maturity, compliance is wisdom, and hesitation is responsibility. The house in Kentucky did not dissipate. It simply succeeded. And once success is achieved at that level, the world quietly builds replicas, without walls, without floors, without doors, inside offices, schools, procedures, and unspoken rules you navigate every day. What followed was not expansion, but dispersion. The idea no longer needed a location. Once silence proved more effective than force, it could be embedded anywhere humans gathered under rules. The principle was simple: overwhelm expression with consequences so subtle they feel self-imposed. The house had taught that lesson perfectly. Everything after was refinement. Around this time, reports emerged from nearby counties of institutions experimenting with extended quiet, wards where conversation was discouraged for healing, facilities where speech was limited for order. No one linked these developments publicly to the house, but internally the language was identical. Reduce stimuli, interrupt feedback loops, encourage stillness. Silence was reframed as calm. Obedience was reframed as wellness. Control was reframed as care. Crowder vanished from the town records entirely one winter. No funeral, no announcement, no inheritance disputes. The house remained. Maintained. Untouched. That alone tells you everything. When individuals disappear without disruption, it means the structure has replaced them. Systems do not mourn creators. They metabolize them. The remaining townspeople behaved as if nothing had happened, because in a way, nothing had. Stability continued. Silence endured. No one needed to be reminded of the rules because the rules were no longer conscious. They were felt. This is the final form of control, when enforcement occurs internally and automatically. One outsider, an educator passing through, noticed something chilling. Children in the town played without shouting. Arguments resolved without raised voices. Even laughter was restrained. When asked why, a boy answered calmly, "Too much noise makes thinking harder." That sentence was not taught. It was absorbed. This is how ideology spreads most effectively, not through instruction, but environment. Here is the truth most people resist. Humans adapt downward faster than they resist upward. Remove freedom gradually. Replace it with comfort and predictability, and most will accept the trade without noticing the loss. The house demonstrated that speech itself is not sacred, only habitual. Remove it slowly, and people will defend the silence as virtue. This is why the story matters now. Because modern systems no longer take voices abruptly. They dilute them. They fragment them. They bury them under procedure, policy, and endless delay until speaking feels useless. You are not silenced. You are exhausted into quiet. The house in 1875 Kentucky proved one terrifying principle beyond doubt. When expression is perceived as ineffective, silence becomes voluntary. And voluntary silence is the most stable form of submission ever discovered. By the 1880s, the house was no longer discussed even in whispers. This was not because fear had faded, but because language itself had become insufficient. The town had learned something most people never articulate. Naming a thing gives it edges, and edges invite intrusion. Silence kept the household untouched, protected. The less it was spoken about, the more complete its influence became. This is the moment where myth hardens into protocol. When something dangerous survives long enough, people stop reacting emotionally and start adjusting behaviorally. The house did not provoke outrage. It produced adaptation. Roads curved around it naturally. Property lines bent. Schedules shifted. All without orders. All without explanation. The environment trained behavior more effectively than any law ever could. Inside the house, nothing changed, because it didn't need to. The structure had already revealed the core flaw in human psychology. Men believe control lives in action, when it truly lives in permission. The moment someone steps into an environment that does not allow expression, they begin negotiating with themselves. First they justify silence. Then they rationalize it. Finally, they internalize it. At that stage, the system no longer needs to restrain them. They restrain themselves. Several written accounts from distant relatives of survivors tell the same story. The men returned quieter, more agreeable, less confrontational. They avoided conflict not because they feared it, but because they no longer believed expression led anywhere meaningful. This is far more dangerous than fear. Fear can trigger rebellion. Futility never does. This is where the house becomes a template rather than a legend. Its true function was not muteness, but learned irrelevance. The visitors did not lose their voices permanently because something blocked their throats. They lost them because speaking no longer felt consequential. Once that belief took hold, silence became logical. And here's the suppressed historical irony. Many modern systems claim to value free expression, yet operate on identical principles. Speak if you wish, but nothing will change. Complain, but procedures will absorb you. Protest, but momentum will be delayed until meaning evaporates. Eventually, people stop trying. Not because they are forbidden, but because they are trained. The house showed, earlier than anyone realized, that domination does not require cruelty. It requires patience and environmental design. Once people conclude their voice has no effect, they voluntarily abandon it. And when silence is voluntary, it is permanent. This is the point of no return. When silence no longer feels imposed, but sensible. When obedience no longer feels like submission, but maturity. The house did not break men. It taught them something wise, that resistance is inefficient. And that lesson, once learned, spreads quietly, far beyond any single house, town, or century. Once resistance is reframed as inefficiency, a man begins policing himself. This was the silent achievement of the house. It did not forbid speech outright. It made speech feel wasteful. And when effort no longer promises impact, the mind conserves energy by withdrawing. This is not oppression in the traditional sense. It is optimization of submission. The town absorbed this lesson so thoroughly that even curiosity began to feel childish. By now, the house no longer needed visitors to prove its effect. Its influence radiated outward through behavior. Men stopped finishing sentences. Questions trailed off. Disagreements resolved themselves through avoidance rather than confrontation. Nothing dramatic. Nothing measurable. And that is precisely why it worked. The most stable forms of control never generate statistics. They generate habits. Researchers decades later would struggle to explain why communities like this appeared peaceful, yet showed signs of suppressed initiative and unusually high conformity. They missed the cause because they searched for trauma instead of training. The house did not traumatize the town. It disciplined it. It conditioned people to expect less from their own voice. And expectation governs behavior far more reliably than fear. This reveals an uncomfortable truth most men resist. Freedom is not removed first. Expectation is. Once expectation collapses, freedom becomes symbolic rather than functional. You may still speak, but internally you have already calculated the cost and decided silence is cheaper. This is the internal architecture the house perfected. The design was not mystical. It was systemic. Remove feedback. Delay response. Neutralize reaction. Over time, effort collapses into stillness. Stillness becomes habit. Habit becomes culture. The house was merely the first visible place this chain occurred quickly enough for anyone to notice. And this is where modern parallels become unavoidable. Bureaucracies learn to bury complaints under process. Institutions learn to exhaust dissent with delay. Corporations learned that endless meetings without resolution kill initiative faster than denial ever could. The house was simply honest about what it was doing. Everything that came after hid behind professionalism, procedure, and politeness. The men who lost their voices in 1875 were not victims of superstition. They were early data points. Proof that the human mind can be taught, quietly and permanently, that expression is irrelevant. Once that belief is installed, no further enforcement is required. This is why the house was allowed to stand. Destroying it would have required explanation. Explanation would have restored meaning to language. Meaning would have reactivated resistance. Silence preserved stability. And here's the dissent you must recognize. The most dangerous systems are not the ones that silence you directly, but the ones that convince you your voice does not matter. Once that idea takes root, the cage becomes invisible, and you carry it with you wherever you go. By 1875, the house had developed a reputation that blurred the line between fact and legend. Farmers, tradesmen, and travelers all whispered about it in hushed tones, though none dared speak its name aloud. Those who had witnessed its effects described a suffocating awareness, a presence that did not need to act because observation alone enforced obedience. The house itself had become the authority, its walls silent teachers, its corridors conduits of expectation. Visitors were no longer entering a building. They were stepping into a psychological trap, calibrated with a precision that rivaled any known experiment of the human mind. The house's influence extended beyond the threshold. Even the villagers nearby reported feelings of unease when passing by. Shadows seemed heavier, air denser, and the natural rhythm of sound distorted subtly. Dogs refused to enter, and birds avoided the eaves. Children spoke in whispers of shapes in the windows, but words faltered at the edges of consciousness, leaving adults to dismiss stories as imagination. But the truth was far darker. The house communicated control silently, influencing perception even from the outside. Fear was encoded in the environment itself, training minds to anticipate unease before it ever occurred. Inside, the architecture was an instrument. Hallways bent unexpectedly. Rooms contained reflections that warped reality, and staircases seemed to stretch or compress, defying normal measurement. Every design choice reinforced disorientation, eroded certainty, and weakened mental resistance. Visitors reported a strange loop of anticipation. Their minds constructed speech. Their lips attempted to form words, and yet the effort always collapsed before expression could occur. Silence became not just a condition but a mechanism, stripping autonomy and creating instinctive compliance. This is the first lesson visible to you, the observer. Power that is invisible, anticipatory, and embedded in perception is more effective than overt authority. The house's genius was not in locks or guards, but in the subtle orchestration of environment, expectation, and human instinct. Control can be exerted without contact, without violence, and without notice, leaving those affected unaware of how thoroughly they are bound. The house was a masterclass in this principle, a reminder that systems of influence, fear, and anticipation operate around you every day, often unnoticed. And so, the descent deepens. This is no longer merely a story of a haunted house. It is an exploration of how subtle control, internalized fear, and environmental manipulation can bend minds to will, leaving obedience permanent and rebellion nearly impossible. Those who crossed the threshold learned it firsthand. Now, you are witnessing it with a mind unshielded. The first documented accounts of those who survived the house were fragmented, yet all shared the same chilling patterns. Scholars and travelers recorded journals filled with hesitation, broken sentences, and unnerving pauses, evidence that even attempting to document the experience risked invoking the house's silent influence. One man described entering a room and realizing he could not speak. He could form the words in his mind, but they dissolved before leaving his lips. Panic rose, but action was stalled. The very tools of self-defense, speech, negotiation, persuasion, had been stripped away. These early visitors began noticing subtle cues, reflections that moved slightly out of sync, floorboards that produced echoes where none should exist, and corridors that seemed to loop back impossibly. Each phenomenon was small on its own, but together they created a persistent sense of anticipation and unease. The house was teaching without words. Every shadow, every unexpected angle, every dissonance in perception became a silent lesson in compliance. It was a system designed to make thought itself hesitant, to make action an exercise in submission. As visitors wondered, they reported a strange phenomenon. The more they tried to speak or assert themselves, the heavier the silence became. Words became trapped in the throat, thoughts looped endlessly, and awareness of failure amplified itself. Some attempted to scream, only to realize that the sound they expected to emerge was swallowed by the house's geometry, absorbed by the atmosphere, as if the very walls were conscious observers, monitoring intention and punishing overreach with absence. It was as if the house could see not just action, but desire, and respond by neutralizing it. Here is the lesson. Hidden in plain sight, authority does not require confrontation. It is more potent when subtle, anticipatory, and embedded in perception. Fear and control become internalized when every movement, every expectation, and every attempt to act are subtly constrained. The house did not strike, it coerced silently, creating a system of obedience that operated beyond awareness. Visitors became instruments of the house's own architecture, perpetuating its power simply by reacting as expected, trapped by anticipation, pattern, and internalized expectation. And now, the narrative deepens. This is not just a tale of a haunted dwelling. It is a blueprint for understanding how environments, rituals, and observation can shape human behavior without touch, without force, and without notice. Each visitor's trauma is an object lesson in the architecture of invisible control, a lesson that we are about to explore further as the descent continues. The house was no accident of construction. Every angle, every line, every window placement carried intention. Its architecture was a language of control, written not in words but in perception. Corridors twisted in patterns that disoriented the mind. Ceilings rose and fell to distort scale, and mirrors reflected reality in fragments, creating doubt about what was real and what was imagined. Each visitor entered a system calibrated to weaken certainty, fracture thought, and make hesitation instinctive. The house was teaching a lesson before a word was spoken. Compliance could be enforced without confrontation, by shaping perception itself. Consider the mirrors. They did more than reflect, they delayed, warped, and multiplied movements, creating the sense that one's actions were both too slow and too fast at the same time. Visitors reported a dissonance in perception, a creeping suspicion that the house was alive in some way, responding to thought and intention. Every reflection became a cue, every delayed echo a subtle punishment. The mind, expecting normal correspondence between action and consequence, struggled to adapt. And as the mind struggled, fear deepened. Speech faltered. Observation became the only tool left. Even the floorboards contributed. Some seemed to absorb sound, some amplified it, creating uncertainty in every step. Hallways looped in imperceptible ways, forcing visitors to question whether they had retraced their path or wandered further into the house. Light and shadow were manipulated meticulously, guiding attention toward cues that reinforced disorientation. Nothing was left to chance. The house was a machine of psychological mastery, an instrument of control operating entirely through the environment. Here is the hidden principle. Control is most absolute when it operates invisibly, shaping expectation before action occurs. Visitors complied not because they were physically restrained, but because perception, anticipation, and internalized fear left no alternative. The house created a feedback loop. Disorientation amplified doubt. Doubt increased hesitation. Hesitation reinforced silence. Each visitor became both subject and enforcer of the system, participating in their own subjugation without realizing it. Now, as you observe, understand that this is not merely a historical oddity. The architecture of influence exists everywhere, in institutions, in social networks, in workplaces, in governments. Patterns, anticipation, and subtle cues shape behavior silently, and often permanently. The house is a masterclass in these invisible mechanisms, a laboratory of obedience, and a warning of what happens when perception itself becomes the instrument of control. The first documented tragedies were subtle at first, almost imperceptible. Visitors returned from the house with fragmented speech, memories of distorted corridors, and an unshakable sense of their own inadequacy. Some left entirely mute, their throats unable to form a single coherent word. Others wandered in circles within the house for hours, convinced they had reached exits that did not exist, only to find themselves back where they started. Panic emerged not from threat, but from anticipation, an awareness that control existed, and that resistance was impossible. One scholar described it as a slow erosion of the self. Thought became hesitant, doubt overwhelming, and the simplest decision, where to step, which way to turn, required intense effort. Words formed in the mind, only to vanish as if intercepted by some unseen barrier. The visitor's body became an instrument of observation rather than action. And yet, paradoxically, no external violence occurred. The house did not strike, push, or confine. Its power was derived entirely from expectation, perception, and the internalized fear of inevitability. Families, townsfolk, and occasional wanderers became part of a living experiment. Those who returned described a suffocating awareness of patterns, symbols, and cues they could not fully articulate. One woman confessed that even writing her experiences was agonizing. The words refused coherence, her pen trembling as if a body resisted forming the truth on paper. The psychological mechanism of the house was self-reinforcing. Observation became enforcement. Fear reinforced itself. Memory fused with expectation, creating loops from which the mind struggled to escape. And yet, the tragedies deepened, not in physical harm, but in the slow unraveling of agency. Visitors became shells of themselves, haunted by a presence they could not name. Silence, disorientation, and anticipation were weapons more precise than any blade. The house taught without instruction, punished without touch, and dominated without speech. Every returnee carried the lesson forward. Compliance, fear, and uncertainty could operate invisibly, yet absolutely. Here is the hidden truth. Environments shape behavior far more effectively than direct confrontation. Subtle cues, anticipation, and internalized expectation create obedience that outlasts immediate presence. The house in Kentucky was not merely a building. It was a system of control, a laboratory for psychological dominance, and a warning that influence need not be seen to be total. And as you follow this descent, understand that you are witnessing a blueprint for power that operates beneath awareness, shaping thought, fear, and action without ever raising a hand. Time inside the house did not pass normally. Hours stretched into eternities, or vanished entirely, leaving visitors disoriented and unmoored. The more they tried to assert control over their own perception, the more the house's architecture and subtle manipulations absorbed them. Fear became anticipatory, thought became recursive, and hesitation hardened into instinct. By the time visitors emerged, if they emerged at all, their minds were permanently recalibrated. Their perception of reality, once fluid, was now bound by expectation and internalized compliance. The cumulative effect was subtle but devastating. Memory fused with trauma, anticipation became a constant weight, and silence was no longer merely a symptom, it was a state of being. Those who had spoken confidently outside its walls found themselves tongue-tied, hesitant, incapable of articulating even the simplest truths. Observation replaced speech. The mind was forced into submission without physical coercion. Each repeated exposure, each interaction with the house's architecture, intensified the pattern. Resistance became impossible not through force, but through habituation. Here lies the lesson hidden beneath the horror. Power is reinforced over time, silently and invisibly. When expectation, observation, and anticipation are manipulated deliberately, compliance becomes instinctive. The house in Kentucky demonstrated a principle every man should understand. Systems, whether architectural, social, or psychological, are far more effective when they shape behavior before action is even considered. Visitors internalized the rules without ever being told, carrying fear and obedience with them as permanent companions. Even after leaving, the influence persisted. People avoided speech subconsciously, hesitated in decision-making, and second-guessed their own instincts. The house had extended itself into their cognition, embedding invisible rules that dictated behavior in every interaction thereafter. Fear became anticipatory, memory became anticipatory, and silence became a habit. Observation alone had taught obedience. The house had created a self-reinforcing network of dominance without ever raising a hand. And now, as you follow the narrative, recognize the depth of the lesson. True control operates on time, expectation, and perception. It does not need to announce itself. It only needs to structure experience so that resistance becomes improbable. The house in Kentucky was a masterclass in this invisible power, teaching that domination does not require confrontation. Awareness of these mechanisms is the first step toward mastery, because once you perceive them, you see the currents shaping behavior everywhere, currents that most men never even notice. The house was more than architecture. It was ritual in physical form. Every hallway, staircase, and room was a symbol, a trigger, a guide for the mind's response. Visitors entered not merely into a building, but into an intricate network of cues designed to fragment certainty and amplify internalized fear. Candles placed in precise geometric arrangements, shadows falling in specific patterns, and mirrors reflecting distorted angles, all functioned as silent instructors, teaching the rules of submission without a single word. These rituals operated on perception and expectation. Light guided attention toward subtle anomalies, sound amplified hesitation, and reflection reinforced doubt. Every movement was anticipated, every response calibrated. The house itself seemed aware, adjusting to the visitor's attempts at rationalization or defiance. It did not punish overtly. It made defiance irrelevant by ensuring the mind obeyed before action was possible. Visitors became participants in their own subjugation, their behaviors reinforced by the environment and the unseen rules embedded in every corner of the house. Observation was the silent enforcer. Mirrors, shadows, and the unpredictable echo of footsteps created feedback loops, allowing the house to subtly monitor and respond to every psychological tremor. Memory became a tool of compliance. Anticipation became a cage. Each visitor experienced isolation in a crowd of one, the house teaching without speech, shaping without force, dominating without contact. The rituals were invisible, yet absolute in their effect. This is the core principle. Influence is strongest when it operates beneath awareness. Subtle cues, carefully orchestrated patterns, and symbolic spaces shape behavior far more effectively than threats or violence. The house did not need to strike. It needed only to exist in alignment with these patterns, allowing the mind itself to become the instrument of control. Visitors left not merely afraid, but fundamentally altered, carrying the architecture of obedience into the world beyond its walls. And now, the lesson becomes personal. You are observing the mechanics of invisible power, how ritual, environment, and expectation converge to shape perception and action. Awareness of these forces grants insight, while ignorance perpetuates subjugation. The house in Kentucky was not just a building. It was a blueprint for domination, a testament to the subtle mastery of human psychology, and a warning of what occurs when perception becomes the instrument of control. Stories spread, whispered cautiously along the hills of Kentucky, of visitors who returned from the house forever changed. They were not physically harmed, but their minds had been altered, their voices stripped, their thoughts constrained by the invisible architecture they had endured. Some could not speak for days, weeks, even months. Others avoided conversation instinctively, as though the house had embedded a permanent hesitation into their cognition. The building's influence extended far beyond its walls, creating an aura of compliance that seeped into the very townsfolk who dared approach it. The first reports hinted at permanent psychological transformation. Visitors described recurring sensations, hallways bending impossibly in memory, mirrors reflecting delay even after leaving, and silence pressing against the mind in moments of stress. Their anticipation of danger, once rooted in the house, became a template for daily life. Fear internalized itself. Words became measured, hesitation instinctive, and obedience unconscious. Memory, ritual, and expectation fused into an internal architecture that mirrored the house itself. They carried the lessons everywhere, an unspoken and unbreakable pattern of control. The legend grew not only because of the house's direct effects, but because of its psychological footprint. Those who spoke, even cautiously, spread tales of disorientation, silence, and the impossibility of resistance. Yet others denied or dismissed these stories, either from disbelief or fear. The tension between rumor and reality created a social system in which the house's influence extended far beyond its doors. Observation and expectation operated as reinforcement even for those who never crossed the threshold. The house had weaponized anticipation itself. Here lies a subtle but powerful truth. Influence does not require proximity or physical threat. Subtle, invisible patterns, ritual, environment, social observation, shape behavior far more effectively than confrontation. The house's genius was in embedding rules into the psyche, ensuring compliance through internalized fear and expectation. Each returnee became a vector of that influence, perpetuating its effect unconsciously. Power, in this context, required no enforcer but the mind itself. As you follow these patterns, consider the lesson for your own perception. The house is a microcosm of all invisible control. Anticipation, observation, and internalized rules operate constantly around you. Recognizing these forces is the first step toward mastery, because once you perceive the current shaping thought and behavior, you can begin to navigate, manipulate, and resist them. Awareness becomes your only weapon in a system designed to operate beneath consciousness. The house's rituals were subtle, yet precise. Candles arranged in impossible geometries, floor patterns that guided footsteps unconsciously, mirrors angled to distort timing. And scale. Each element was a mechanism for psychological manipulation. These were not mere decorations. They were instruments designed to destabilize perception, fracture certainty, and embed anticipation as a permanent mental state. Visitors did not merely observe, they were participants in a ritual they could not name, their compliance self-reinforced by the very architecture around them. Anticipation was the true instrument of control. The house taught that thought and speech could be anticipated, trapped, and suppressed before action ever occurred. The mind, expecting to act, was denied the ability to articulate intention. Every attempt to speak, move, or assert agency was met with subtle cues that amplified hesitation. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, echoes lagged slightly, and corridors bent just enough to suggest missteps. Visitors became conditioned to pause, to doubt, and to self-correct even before failure was possible. The house weaponized expectation, turning the mind into its own jailer. Over time, this internalization became permanent. Those who returned carried the house's influence into daily life. Hesitation in speech, instinctive compliance, and anxiety in moments requiring decision. The rituals were no longer external. They existed in the mind itself. Memory fused with anticipation, forming a feedback loop that reinforced compliance without external enforcement. Observation alone was sufficient to sustain power, and each individual became both subject and instrument of the system. This is the deeper lesson hidden beneath horror. Environments, rituals, and subtle cues shape human behavior far more effectively than direct force. Power that operates invisibly, anticipates action, and internalizes fear is absolute. The house was a laboratory, a masterclass in subtle control. Visitors experienced domination not as an event, but as a process, a slow, meticulous restructuring of thought and perception. Now, as you follow this descent, understand that this is not just history, it is a blueprint. Awareness of these patterns allows perception to expand beyond ordinary limits. Observation becomes insight, anticipation becomes comprehension, and understanding becomes mastery. The house teaches that the mind can be reshaped invisibly, that compliance can be encoded without speech, and that awareness is the first step toward liberation from forces most men never perceive. The house's power was magnified when multiple visitors entered simultaneously. Alone, its effect was profound, bending perception and silencing speech. Together, its mechanisms created something more insidious: social reinforcement of internalized fae. Visitors observed each other's hesitation, their inability to speak, their unnatural pauses, and unconsciously adjusted their own behavior to match. Compliance became a group phenomenon, a self-perpetuating network in which anticipation and doubt were amplified through observation. Imagine entering a room where every face is frozen, every voice absent, and every movement measured. Each visitor becomes both mirror and warning for the others, reinforcing the invisible rules without a single command. The house leveraged instinctive social conformity. Humans are conditioned to match the behavior of those around them, and when all surrounding behavior signals fear, compliance spreads like wildfire. The silence itself becomes a teacher, the anticipation a regulator, and each individual's mind a node in a collective system of obedience. Even subtle cues, unnoticed consciously, reinforced the house's control. A glance, a delayed step, the smallest twitch of hesitation. It all contributed to a feedback loop. Visitors corrected themselves to match the expected pattern. Deviations were instantly punished, not with force, but with amplified disorientation and anticipation. Speech, once attempted, faltered. Action, once considered, stalled. Observation alone maintained dominance. The group, like a microcosm of society, became a living instrument of internalized control. This is where the lesson deepens. Influence does not require force. It requires alignment of perception, expectation, and social reinforcement. Patterns observed in one mind spread effortlessly to others, embedding obedience before conscious thought occurs. The house had perfected this, turning each visitor into both subject and enforcer. The network of compliance extended beyond the walls. Stories, rumors, and silent fear carried the same lesson outward, amplifying its reach. And now, consider yourself observing this system. The principle is universal. Groups, environments, and subtle cues can shape behavior invisibly, with permanent effect. Anticipation, observation, and internalized rules create obedience far more effective than overt threat. The House of Kentucky is a blueprint for this mastery, teaching that true control spreads through perception, memory, and social feedback, leaving participants complicit in their own subjugation without ever raising a hand. Repeated exposure to the house amplified its influence in ways that defy ordinary understanding. Each visit, each hesitant step, each moment of internalized silence reinforced the invisible architecture embedded in the mind. Fear became anticipatory, hesitation instinctive, and compliance unconscious. The house did not need to increase its overt control. The mind itself became the enforcer. Memory fused with expectation, creating loops from which resistance became nearly impossible. Visitors were no longer simply affected, they were permanently altered. Accounts describe subtle but profound changes. People who had once been confident, articulate, and decisive returned unable to trust their own instincts. Their thoughts faltered before expression, decisions were second-guessed before being made, and even familiar environments induced the same unease experienced inside the house. Observation alone had imposed mastery. No threat, no violence, no spoken command, yet obedience persisted, internalized and self-reinforcing. The house had extended beyond architecture into cognition itself. The mechanism is precise. Anticipation and expectation operate invisibly, guiding thought before action. Each repeated exposure strengthens the association between environment, ritual, and fae. Behavioral loops become ingrained, subconscious, and automatic. Visitors became architects of their own compliance. Their instincts aligned with patterns imposed silently. The house did not act directly. It shaped perception so effectively that resistance was rendered irrelevant. Its lessons were encoded permanently, an unseen curriculum of obedience and anticipation. And the effect was cumulative. Each return visit not only reinforced internalized patterns but also heightened sensitivity to the house's cues. Mirrors, shadows, echoes, and angles, all subtle instruments, became triggers. Anxiety, hesitation, and silence were no longer situational. They were embedded traits, unshakable reflexes trained by repetition. The mind became a map of the house itself, a psychological mirror that could be activated anywhere by the smallest reminder of its mechanisms. Here's the profound warning: environments shape minds more than direct force ever can. The house is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a template for understanding invisible systems of control. Anticipation, internalized expectation, and repetition create obedience without confrontation. Awareness of these mechanisms is your first step toward mastery, because once perceived, you recognize the currents shaping thought, fear, and action everywhere, forces most men never even notice, but which dictate behavior relentlessly. The house's architecture was its silent language, encoding control in every detail. Ceilings rose to distort scale, corridors looped to fracture expectation, and mirrors reflected reality in fragmented, delayed sequences. Visitors did not merely navigate space, they navigated a psychological labyrinth where perception was constantly challenged. Every design choice amplified internalized fear, reinforcing hesitation and embedding obedience deep within cognition. The house was teaching a lesson without words. Power operates most efficiently when the mind enforces it upon itself. Symbols were everywhere, subtle yet precise. Candles placed in geometric formations guided movement unconsciously. Floor patterns induced hesitation at critical moments. Reflections reinforced doubt, amplifying anticipation. The house's mechanisms worked collectively, producing feedback loops where observation and expectation merged. Visitors became both subject and participant, reinforcing their own subjugation as they attempted, unsuccessfully, to assert agency. Silence was not imposed, it was cultivated, a skillful byproduct of design and perception. Over time, these patterns became internalized. Visitors carried the lessons beyond the walls: instinctive hesitation, anticipatory fear, and self-enforced compliance. Each return visit strengthened these neural pathways, turning temporary confusion into permanent conditioning. The house did not rely on brute force. It relied on psychology, perception, and the subtle orchestration of environment. Memory fused with expectation, creating a cognitive map of control that could persist for life. The collective myth of the house amplified its power. Stories spread in whispers, creating anticipation even among those who had never entered. Fear was encoded socially as well as psychologically. The legend served as reinforcement, observation, rumor, and expectation converged to extend the house's influence. Compliance became a network phenomenon, perpetuated beyond the immediate environment, and fear became anticipatory on a scale far larger than the physical building. And here's the crucial lesson: environments, symbols, and perception are instruments of power more precise than violence. Systems that operate invisibly, that align expectation with action before it occurs, achieve absolute dominance. The house is an extreme illustration of these principles, but its mechanisms exist everywhere, in institutions, social networks, and subtle rituals. Awareness of these currents is the first step toward mastery, because only by perceiving invisible influence can a man begin to navigate, resist, and eventually command it himself. The house's influence extended far beyond its walls. Fear, anticipation, and the internalized lessons of silence began to shape the town itself. Residents unconsciously mirrored the patterns established inside: hesitation in speech, measured movements, and instinctive obedience. Social interactions became subtle exercises in compliance, guided not by law or explicit instruction, but by observation, expectation, and internalized fear. The house had created a psychological ecosystem that thrived long after the building was left behind. Visitors who returned carried the imprint of its lessons into daily life. Their speech was cautious, their decisions calculated, and their behavior constrained by anticipation. They shared stories in whispers, fragmentary and cautious, reinforcing both the myth and the internalized compliance of others. Observation became a tool of regulation. People adjusted instinctively to match patterns of fear and hesitation, creating a self-reinforcing social network of control. Those who resisted felt subtle pressure, often unspoken, that corrected behavior before confrontation could occur. The legend itself became a mechanism of power. Tales of the house, exaggerated yet persistent, created anticipation and anxiety for those who had never crossed its threshold. Fear spread through rumor, observation, and social expectation, embedding obedience into the collective consciousness. The town became a laboratory of invisible influence. Authority operated through suggestion, ritual, and the anticipation of consequence. Control no longer required the presence of the house. The pattern was internalized, replicated, and amplified socially. Here is the broader lesson. Systems of influence operate most effectively when they become self-perpetuating. Observation, expectation, and social reinforcement create compliance without visible force. The house was the prototype, the extreme example of a principle that exists in countless forms in everyday life. Power does not need to announce itself. It only needs to shape perception, align expectation, and create internalized rules that guide behavior automatically. As you follow this story, understand that the house is not merely a historical oddity. It is a blueprint for understanding how influence spreads through environment, ritual, and social expectation. Those who are aware can navigate it consciously, resisting internalized patterns and decoding the invisible mechanisms at work. Those who are unaware remain trapped in anticipation, silence, and compliance, subject to forces they never perceive. Observation is your first tool. Awareness is your first weapon. The house's control was not accidental. It was engineered with precision to exploit the human mind. Anticipation, ritual, and environment converged to create permanent cognitive imprinting. Visitors learned, almost imperceptibly, that speech, thought, and action were unsafe. Every shadow, echo, and mirrored reflection reinforced hesitation. Every step and glance became a lesson in self-regulation, teaching that autonomy carried invisible consequences. The house did not coerce, it instructed, subtly and relentlessly, embedding obedience into neural patterns. Ritual amplified perception. Candles, mirrors, and floor patterns were calibrated to disrupt expectation and fragment attention. Visitors' eyes darted involuntarily, hearts raced, and the body reacted before consciousness could intervene. The mind, attempting to assert control, was trapped in a feedback loop. Anticipation amplified fear. Fear reinforced hesitation. Hesitation reinforced compliance. Visitors became participants in their own subjugation, encoding obedience into thought itself. No threat was required. Control existed in every perception and every memory. Long-term effects were profound. Survivors reported persistent hesitation in everyday decisions, difficulty articulating ideas, and anticipatory fear triggered by mundane environments. The lessons of the house were permanent, internalized, and unconscious. The mind itself had become a mirror of the building's mechanisms. Memory, observation, and expectation fused to form a pattern of behavior that persisted outside its walls. Silence and hesitation became reflexive, obedience a default state. The house had extended beyond architecture into cognition itself. And here is the critical truth. Systems of invisible influence operate everywhere. Ritual, expectation, and observation can guide behavior far more effectively than explicit instruction or coercion. The house is an extreme illustration, but the principle is universal. Environments, social networks, and subtle cues shape thought and action continuously. Awareness of these mechanisms is essential. Recognizing how anticipation, internalized fear, and environmental cues shape behavior is the first step toward mastery. Now, as you witness this descent, understand that knowledge itself is dangerous. Once perceived, the mechanisms of invisible control cannot be unseen. Observation becomes insight. Awareness becomes foresight. And the internalized patterns that govern most men become tools for those who recognize them. The house in Kentucky is not merely a story. It is a lesson in the architecture of power itself. At the midpoint of this descent, there is a ritual embedded in observation, a symbolic phrase, repeated deliberately, that locks in awareness and aligns perception with insight. It is not magic. It is the principle of internalization. The human mind responds to repetition, anticipation, and conscious acknowledgement. By declaring a phrase aloud, twice, you anchor comprehension, cementing recognition of invisible influence and reinforcing the cognitive shift you are undergoing. This is a step many will resist, subconsciously, but the act itself solidifies insight and awakens dormant perception. The phrase itself is simple, yet potent. Repeating it engages attention, activates memory, and aligns neural patterns with awareness of control systems. It is a mental key, signaling the mind to recognize patterns, to detect anticipation, and to resist subtle influence. Those who comply with this small act begin to observe differently, think differently, and perceive the hidden structures around them. The house would have used the same principle, subtle ritual, repeated engagement, and conscious acknowledgement to internalize obedience. You are now using it in reverse, to reclaim autonomy. Why twice? Because repetition enforces permanence. The first utterance alerts the conscious mind. The second penetrates deeper layers of perception. Habits, fears, and anticipatory responses are encoded over time. Conscious repetition accelerates the process, ensuring that awareness is not fleeting but structural. The mind begins to recognize the invisible architecture of influence, decoding environmental cues, social patterns, and subtle rituals before they can dictate thought. In essence, you begin to see the system as the system sees you. And here's the lesson hidden in plain sight. Knowledge must be acted upon to transform. Observation alone is insufficient. Engagement cements insight. The house, in its own design, demanded compliance through anticipation and repetition. You now demand comprehension and autonomy through the same principle. By repeating this phrase twice, you are not participating in a story. You are performing a ritual of mastery, consciously aligning your perception to recognize, resist, and command the forces most men never notice. As you engage, remember this: the path forward is a descent into understanding, not a narrative of fate. Each repetition, each observation, each moment of recognition strengthens the architecture of perception within your mind. You are no longer merely a witness. You are now an active participant in the mastery of awareness, seeing patterns invisible to the untrained eye, and reclaiming the authority that fear once held over the mind. Survivors of the house's influence described a transformation beyond ordinary comprehension. The mind, once fractured by anticipation, disorientation, and silence, began to adapt, internalizing patterns of observation, caution, and reflection. Those who endured repeatedly emerged with heightened awareness, a dangerous, double-edged mastery. They could detect subtle cues, anticipate outcomes, and navigate complex systems of influence that others could not perceive. Yet this power came at a cost. The same neural architecture that produced insight also retained the imprint of the house's control, a permanent reminder that perception alone could dominate thought. The internalized lessons of the house were subtle yet absolute. Silence and hesitation became tools rather than afflictions. Anticipatory fear transformed into vigilance. Observation replaced impulsive action. Visitors who survived learned to operate within invisible systems of control, decoding patterns, rituals, and social expectations before they could dictate behavior. This was mastery born of exposure to extreme influence, a cognitive adaptation that allowed them to see the unseen and navigate danger that others would not even recognize. Repeated exposure cemented these mechanisms. Each visit reinforced neural pathways shaped by the house's architecture, rituals, and subtle manipulations. Memory, attention, and expectation fused, creating reflexive patterns of thought that could anticipate and resist external influence. The survivors became architects of their own cognition, capable of perceiving power systems invisible to the untrained eye. Every step, glance, and pause became calibrated to recognize and counteract manipulation. And here is the critical principle: mastery of the mind is inseparable from awareness of the forces shaping it. The house is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a template for understanding invisible systems of power, anticipation, and internalized control. Those who perceive its lessons can navigate the currents of influence, anticipating manipulation before it occurs, and reclaiming agency over thought, behavior, and decision-making. Knowledge becomes action. Observation becomes mastery. As you continue this descent, recognize the value of internalized awareness. The house demonstrates how environments, ritual, and repeated exposure can shape thought with precision. The survivor's insight is a warning and a guide. The mind is both instrument and battlefield, and those who understand its invisible architecture gain a form of control most men never suspect exists. Observation, repetition, and conscious engagement are your tools. Learn to wield them wisely. The survivors carried more than memory. They carried influence. Their transformed cognition, refined through exposure to the house, became a living vector of its lessons. Speech, movement, and decision-making were calibrated by anticipation and internalized observation, and those around them noticed. Not consciously, not immediately, but subtle cues of hesitation, measured behavior, and anticipatory awareness spread. The survivor's presence enforced a silent social code, one born of extreme psychological conditioning yet replicated unconsciously by others. This is the essence of social echo, influence multiplied through observation. Fear, compliance, and anticipation no longer required. Direct intervention. The survivors embodied the lessons of the house. People unconsciously aligned their behavior, mimicking hesitation, careful speech, and anticipation. A single transformed individual created ripples, amplified by attention, imitation, and the innate human tendency to conform to observed patterns. The house, though confined physically, extended its reach indefinitely through the altered minds of those who endured it. Legends grew in tandem with these psychological echoes. Rumors spread, distorted by memory and fear, embedding themselves into the collective consciousness. The house's reputation became an invisible enforcer of anticipation and compliance. Even those who never entered instinctively adjusted to the expectation of danger. The environment was no longer necessary. The social network of transformed cognition sustained the principles of the house. Observation alone perpetuated its mastery. Here lies a lesson visible to those who pay attention. Power operates as much through observation and replication as through action. Subtle behavior, internalized rules, and anticipation can dictate the conduct of others without threat or coercion. The survivors of the house demonstrate that influence is contagious, and awareness of these mechanisms is the only safeguard against becoming an unwitting vector of control. Their mastery was both protective and transmissive, a template for understanding invisible systems of influence in the world beyond Kentucky. And now, as you continue this descent, recognize your own position in the network of observation. Every pattern you detect, every hesitation you note, every anticipatory adjustment you make is part of a system that most men cannot see. Awareness allows you to act consciously, resist invisible influence, and reclaim authority over thought, behavior, and perception. This is no longer a story about a house. It is a guide to recognizing and mastering the unseen forces that shape reality. Not everyone survived the house's influence intact. For some, the mechanisms of anticipation, ritual, and internalized fear fractured the mind entirely. Visitors who resisted consciously, attempting to speak, act, or assert autonomy, often met with subtle but relentless punishment. Their thoughts twisted, their memories looped, and hesitation became paralysis. Words dissolved mid-thought, intentions were erased before reaching action. The mind, unprepared for such precise manipulation, began to unravel under the weight of its own expectation. Psychological collapse was not dramatic in the conventional sense. It was quiet, incremental, and merciless. Victims reported feelings of estrangement from reality. Corridors appeared in memory that did not exist, reflections delayed movements that had long passed, and silence became a suffocating presence in everyday life. They could not articulate the reason for their unease. The house's influence persisted invisibly, a permanent template of control imprinted upon cognition. Anticipation became a prison, and the mind became both prisoner and warden. Morally, the consequences were equally severe. Visitors who resisted the rules imposed by the house often found themselves socially isolated, mistrusted, or dismissed. The anticipatory compliance of others amplified the ostracism, reinforcing the lesson that deviation carried invisible but immediate cost. Obedience, silence, and measured hesitation became adaptive survival strategies, while defiance, even in thought, produced dissonance and punishment. The house's architecture had taught that power is more absolute when it enforces not through violence, but through anticipation, expectation, and internalized compliance. Here is the unspoken principle: failure to perceive and integrate the mechanisms of influence carries consequences that are both cognitive and social. Control can operate invisibly, shaping thought, behavior, and interaction without overt confrontation. The house in Kentucky is an extreme illustration, but the principle applies everywhere. Anticipate, adapt, internalize, or succumb to patterns that you cannot see until it is too late. Those who fail are trapped not by walls, but by expectation. As you follow this descent, understand the stakes. Knowledge is both weapon and shield. Awareness allows mastery, resistance, and adaptation. Ignorance, even in small measures, leaves a mind vulnerable to forces operating silently, invisibly, yet absolutely. The house's lessons are not fiction. They are a warning, a blueprint, and a guide to the hidden architecture of control that governs far more of reality than most men ever suspect. The house's influence did not end with a single visitor. Its lessons, once internalized, propagated through observation, imitation, and the subtle networks of human behavior. Children of those who had entered the house often displayed heightened anticipation, hesitation, and awareness long before ever crossing its threshold. The patterns of fear, silence, and compliance had become embedded socially, cognitively, and culturally. The house, though a physical location, had achieved a kind of immortality through the minds it touched. Generational transmission amplified its effect. Parents who had experienced the house unconsciously taught caution, measured speech, and anticipatory obedience. These lessons were reinforced through subtle social cues, ritual, and expectation. The architecture of influence had moved beyond walls, floors, and mirrors. It now resided in cognition itself, carried invisibly through language, gesture, and example. Observation replaced instruction. Anticipation replaced threat. The building's mastery had become permanent, woven into the very culture that surrounded it. The house's legacy was also reinforced through legend. Stories, exaggerated and fragmented, ensured that even those untouched by direct exposure approached it with fear and caution. Anticipation, expectation, and social conformity converged to extend the reach of its influence indefinitely. Silence became a tool, hesitation a habit, and internalized compliance a structural element of cognition. The house was no longer confined to space. It existed in perception, memory, and culture, a template for understanding invisible systems of power. Here is the vital lesson. Influence is most potent when it transcends physical presence. Anticipation, repetition, observation, and ritual allow control to persist across time, generations, and social networks. The Kentucky house demonstrates that domination does not require violence or authority. It requires the precise alignment of perception, memory, and expectation. Those who perceive these systems gain insight and mastery. Those who do not remain bound, obedient to patterns they cannot name or resist. As you near the conclusion of this descent, recognize the permanence of awareness. Knowledge, once internalized, creates resilience, perception, and the capacity to navigate invisible currents of power. The house's lessons are encoded not in stone or timber, but in the mind, echoing across generations. Understanding its mechanisms grants perspective, foresight, and the subtle mastery over systems most men cannot even perceive. The house in Kentucky is no longer simply a place. It is a masterclass in invisible power. Its lessons transcend walls, corridors, and mirrors. They exist in memory, expectation, and anticipation. Those who enter, those who observe, and those who hear its story are forever altered. Silence, hesitation, and internalized compliance become more than responses. They become instruments of control. Yet awareness of these mechanisms grants a different power. Perception becomes mastery, and observation becomes insight. Understand this, influence is rarely overt. It operates through anticipation, repetition, ritual, and subtle environmental cues. The house's genius lay in shaping thought before action, encoding obedience without force, and reinforcing patterns through observation and memory. Each visitor, each survivor, each story became part of the network, perpetuating the house's control long after any physical exposure. Fear was internalized, compliance became reflexive, memory became both record and regulator. The mind itself had become a battleground, and the house had won silently, absolutely, and permanently, unless its lessons were recognized and understood. The final lesson is clear, and it is dangerous. The currents of invisible influence are everywhere. Environments, social networks, rituals, and repeated patterns shape behavior without overt coercion. Anticipation and expectation are more powerful than threats, observation more precise than force. Those who perceive these systems gain agency, foresight, and control over forces that operate unnoticed by the majority. Ignorance is not harmless. It is the condition that allows subtle domination to flourish. You, now, stand at the threshold of understanding. The house is no longer a distant story. It is a lens through which to view reality. Observation, repetition, and awareness are tools of liberation. Recognizing patterns, decoding expectation, and understanding the architecture of influence allows you to reclaim authority over thought, behavior, and perception. What once imprisoned others now becomes a blueprint for mastery. Remember this forever. The mind is both instrument and battlefield. The house teaches that true power is invisible, anticipatory, and internalized. Knowledge transforms perception, awareness transforms action, and those who walk this path consciously will see what most men cannot, navigate what most cannot endure, and command forces that are otherwise unperceivable. The house in Kentucky is not merely history. It is the key to understanding control, influence, and mastery itself.